Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today. And to kick us off, my colleague Ana Velasco will share some more about introductions and also some housekeeping for today's conversation. But thank you very much for joining. Ana, over to you.
Hello, everyone. Shall we start? Sorry about that. It's just I'm still at the university and some things cannot wait. Welcome to the launching of the report Mexico's Feminist Foreign Policy, a brief evaluation. Buenos días in Mexico and Colombia, good afternoon here in Europe, and good night in India and Australia. My name is Ana Velasco. I am one of the co-founders of Internacional Feminista, which is very proudly to host this event. It is a pleasure to welcome you to the launch of this report. But before we start, I'd like to thank our audience for their time and interest in this topic. We presented this report in Spanish last year with the support of a partner organization, Global Thought, and the support also of the Tec de Monterrey. So saludos a Tatiana and Daira. But since the debate around feminist foreign policies is still concentrated in the global north, we decided to translate this report to English in an effort to contribute to the conversation with an independent perspective that is very much grounded on our experiences with feminism and as feminists in Mexico. We would also like to thank all the wonderful women that made the report and this event possible: Monse, Beth, Nicole, Alina, Paola, Brianda, Priyanka, Rosa, Laura, and of course, Anne. Thanks all for your trust and your generosity. So just a little bit of what is normally called housekeeping. Translation is available in Spanish and English. There will be time for questions at the end, but you can also leave your comments and a few questions that come while we are discussing in the chat. And I would just like to introduce journalist, a friend of mine that I'm really happy that she decided to join us and she's supporting us to moderate the event. And Deland, Dr. Deland is an Australian journalist and researcher based in Mexico City. She has reported extensively on feminist politics and policy in Mexico for outlets such as Foreign Policy, Women Under Siege, and the Australian Broadcasting Corporation. So thank you, Anne.
Thank you, Anna. It's a real pleasure to be here and to be moderating such an important discussion. Having covered this topic as a journalist in an international context, it's certainly clear to me that there are some gaps missing in the conversation. So let's fill them today. I'll begin by introducing Internacional Feminista. It's a platform created by feminist researchers and advocates who are passionate about foreign policy, international security, and diplomacy. IF's objective is to contribute to the movement building led by activists, collectives, and civil society to reappropriate the international gender equality agenda. IF seeks to help build, monitor, and evaluate public policies and initiatives that guarantee an inclusive approach and radical feminist transformation. So we're going to begin by speaking with the authors of the report, Dani, Anna, and Dainora. Let's begin with you, Anna. When we're thinking about the report, Mexico's Feminist Foreign Policy, a brief evaluation, could you speak to the question, who is and who is not sitting at the table in the talks about Mexico's feminist foreign policy?
Right, okay. So I don't have an easy question, but I'll try my best. First of all, I am not sure that there is a table at all. At least just not one. And what I mean by that is the talks about the Mexican feminist foreign policy, in my opinion, occur in two distinct spheres. The first one is that of the global North feminist civil society and the Mexican government. As I said in my opening remarks, the debates around what feminist foreign policy is and how we should go about it are concentrated in forums, research centers, and NGOs from the global north. And this is obviously no coincidence, as this framework started in Sweden, as we know, and has been adopted by countries mostly from this region. This inadvertently or not reflects dynamics of knowledge production, claims of expertise, and allocation of resources that have been already noted and at times criticized by scholars and activists from the global south, or by those positioned as subalterns in this context. And why am I saying this? Well, because Mexico plays an important role in this debate. Since the moment the Mexican government presented its feminist foreign policy, it was praised by this community in the global north as the first country from the global south in joining the club. And honestly, in my opinion, there was indeed a tone of a little bit of surprise, and if I may, even a bit of condescendence. And yet the Mexican government has actively participated in these spaces, flying the feminist flag. And why is that? Well, it is a mutually beneficial agreement. Some of these organizations that prioritize the optics of inclusion, and I have to remark that, the optics of inclusion, check the mark by bringing an actor from the global south, while the government gets to say they engage with civil society. And I have to say, from my point of view, this inclusion of Mexico is, of course, positive for opening a truly global dialogue, but it has also been quite limited in its criticism. If the idea of a feminist civil society is to exercise a counterweight to the states, then it is not clear how this is developing between civil society in the global north and the Mexican government. So where do we actually see this attempt to monitor and evaluate? In the other sphere, where we are today, so activists and academics. And now, to be frank, yes, this is a very small conversation. There are only a few feminist organizations in Mexico that are busy and concerned with the feminist foreign policy. But this is a reflection of at least two phenomena. The concerns and resources are allocated on issues, well, hopefully resources, that are more immediate and urgent, like disappearances, violence against women, femicides, etc. And also about the fact that foreign policy in countries like Mexico has historically been formulated without the participation of local civil society. It is a very elitist realm. So consequently, the government of Mexico in this case has very few incentives to open the dialogue with organizations like ours. And we have asked for that dialogue. We have tried to contact them, and there is only silence. So as feminists, particularly in contexts like Latin America, in my opinion, we have the responsibility of asking these questions, not only, as you say, and who is sitting in this conversation, but under which conditions of possibility are these conversations happening and who benefits from them? So hopefully I answered.
I think so. Thank you, Ana. Let's turn to you now, Danny. Speaking as Internacional Feminista, why did you decide to write this report? And what was your approach to writing the report? Can you speak a bit about the methodology, the resources that you used, things like that?
Yes, of course, Anne. Thank you. And before I begin, I would like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people, who are the traditional custodians of the land where I am today. I would like to pay respect to their elders, both past and present. And I also want to say thank you to all the panelists and to the organizers of this event. And thank you to the audience for joining us, especially if you're in Australia, because it's quite late. So we decided to conduct this research and evaluate Mexico's feminist foreign policy because it was unclear to us what a feminist foreign policy was supposed to look like in a country like ours, in Mexico. Mexico is very different from countries like Sweden, Canada, France, and Luxembourg. And we were genuinely curious to know how a feminist foreign policy would be implemented in Mexico. So we began by conducting desk research, and we were looking to identify the specific action items, budget, and the intended impact of Mexico's feminist foreign policy. But we could not find anything. And we also strongly believe that policies, especially policies that call themselves feminist, should be crafted with the input of local feminist actors. However, we also could not find any evidence that this had been the case for Mexico's feminist foreign policy. So there were two key factors that propelled us into action. Number one, the lack of transparency, and number two, the lack of meaningful participation and consultation with Mexican feminists and civil society. So we then decided it was important to conduct an in-depth and independent evaluation of Mexico's feminist foreign policy, mainly to create transparency and accountability. And so then we had to ask ourselves, how do we create accountability? How do we go about that? And number one is we needed clarity on how exactly the government was seeking, what it was seeking to achieve, and how. And because there is very little information available on this, we filed freedom of information requests. We then based our methodology and our research on the information that was provided to us by the government, which also, as a result of our requests, is now available to the public on Mexico's National Transparency Platform. So in addition to filing these requests, we conducted semi-structured interviews and monitored social media content. We then analyzed the data that had been provided to us by the government and drafted 2 case studies on gender-based violence that involved the Foreign Affairs Ministry. So when designing our methodology, one issue that we considered particularly important was the limitation of external validity when studying feminist foreign policy. In other words, we realized that comparing Mexico's feminist foreign policy to that of other countries did not really make sense. Almost all of the other countries with a feminist foreign policy are developed, and they are high-income countries with the capacity to provide official development aid, and who also just play a very different role in multilateral fora and in geopolitics in general. Those countries have a much larger military and defense budgets as a result of having a larger GDP, and also have a very different legacy of colonialism relative to that of Mexico. So ultimately, we think that if feminist foreign policy is quantified and reduced to numbers, the result is going to be misleading and superficial, precisely because it will not be able to address these complexities. So to conclude, for our research, it was important to highlight that Mexico's context does not align with the contexts of those other countries, and that it should not be compared to those without nuance. And so for that reason, the methodology that we used for this report is based on the principles and objectives that Mexico's Foreign Affairs Secretariat set for itself. And we use those goals and those objectives, which are 5 pillars that the Mexican Foreign Affairs Secretariat defined. We use those as the benchmarks for evaluating Mexico's feminist foreign policy. And also by reviewing the literature on feminist international relations theory. And in particular, one report that I always cite, which is the German WULPS section toolkit on practicing feminist foreign policy in the everyday. And with that, I would like to conclude my participation and turn it over to Leonora to go over the main findings and recommendations.
Thanks, Danny. Leonora, we have a question for you to conclude. Can you tell us what the main findings and recommendations were of this report that is being launched today?
Yes. Hola a todas, todos y todes. Es un gusto estar aquí con ustedes. Es muy temprano en esta parte del mundo, entonces agradezco mucho su interés. Bueno, yo resumiría los hallazgos de nuestra investigación, pues partiendo por el hecho de que la política exterior feminista de México, en sus 5 principios, pues es muy ambiciosa en términos de que plantean acciones en las distintas competencias de la Secretaría de Relaciones Exteriores. A esto me refiero a la cultura organizacional y relaciones laborales de género entre el personal de la Cancillería y las representaciones en el exterior, pero también habla un poco del diseño y la implementación de la política diplomática de México. Y bueno, en términos de la competencia interna de la Cancillería, de acuerdo con nuestra investigación, vemos que hay una brecha entre lo anunciado, o sea, los 5 principios de la política exterior feminista de México, y lo implementado, ¿no? En nuestra investigación documentamos que desde que Andrés Manuel López Obrador tomó posesión el 1 de diciembre de 2018 hasta el 24 de septiembre de 2022, se remitieron 81 nombramientos diplomáticos, de los cuales 55 fueron de hombres y 26 de mujeres. Entonces, ay, mi perrita, perdón. Entonces, solo un 32% de los nombramientos diplomáticos fueron de mujeres, ¿no? Y haciendo una actualización, en una nueva investigación del Instituto Mexicano para la Competitividad, dice que la Secretaría de Relaciones Exteriores cuenta con 31% de representación de mujeres en los puestos de Subsecretaría de Estado, Jefaturas de Unidad y Dirección General, que son los puestos más altos en la jerarquía de la Cancillería, ¿no? Y bueno, también nosotros hicimos notar en la investigación que desde que se anunció la política exterior feminista, pues no se incrementaron exponencialmente los programas de fortalecimiento en las capacidades en materia de género del personal de la Cancillería. Y tristemente tampoco se redujeron exponencialmente las denuncias de acoso y hostigamiento sexual reportadas a la Dirección General de Recursos Humanos y Personal, ¿no? Bueno, eso por una parte, y por la parte de la competencia externa de la Cancillería, pues nosotros documentamos que sí también hay rezagos importantes en términos de las prioridades, ¿no? El género no ha sido un tema prioritario fuera de las acciones multilaterales. En el ámbito multilateral sí resaltamos el gran papel que ha tenido México en los foros internacionales, sobre todo para promover los derechos de las mujeres. Sin embargo, esto no necesariamente empezó por el anuncio de la política exterior feminista, sino que viene pues por la gran trayectoria y las doctrinas diplomáticas de México que desde hace muchos años, ¿no? Y bueno, esto nada más para evidenciarlo, cito el último informe de la organización Intersecta, que dice que en el en el 2021, el gasto federal en los recursos para los refugios para las mujeres víctimas de violencia fue de 415 millones de pesos, mientras que las Fuerzas Armadas gastaron 459 millones de pesos en viáticos para viajes en el extranjero. Y justo en nuestro informe documentamos que el anuncio de la política exterior feminista no se vio reflejado en un aumento en las actividades de género, sobre todo del anexo 13 de erogaciones para igualdad entre hombres y mujeres, etiquetados para la Secretaría de Relaciones Exteriores. Y bueno, en otros ámbitos de la competencia externa de la Cancillería, como el tema consular, pues vimos que se siguen cometiendo revictimización y falta de apoyo para mujeres sobrevivientes y víctimas de violencia de género, sobre todo en países de Asia y África, donde nuestra red consular no es tan grande como la de Norteamérica, ¿no? En nuestro informe documentamos el caso de Paola Schat, que fue muy viral en redes sociales, que se trata de una mujer que residía en Qatar y quien fue procesada penalmente por su agresor y a quien, de acuerdo con su testimonio, no se le proveyó la atención consular de acuerdo con los distintos protocolos de género y derechos humanos que tiene la Cancillería. Asimismo, en términos de las relaciones diplomáticas con nuestros principales socios comerciales y políticos, pues México ha tenido acuerdos pues que van en detrimento de los derechos para las mujeres, ¿no? Solo por citar un caso, pues Estados Unidos y México están utilizando a México como tercer país seguro de facto para personas solicitantes de asilo, afectando la integridad de las mujeres en la migración y sus seres queridos. Y bueno, ya en conclusión, en resumen, pues todas nuestras recomendaciones atienden esto, ¿no? En general hacemos un llamado a pasar de la retórica a la acción, que es una constante en las políticas exteriores feministas. Pues sí, hacemos un llamado para que pues se vea reflejado en que todo el personal de la Secretaría y las representaciones diplomáticas y en todos los ámbitos de la política exterior se apropien del actor feminista. Debe haber reglas, redes y recursos para que se asegure la continuidad de la política exterior feminista. Y para esto recomendamos hacer de la política exterior feminista una política acorde al ciclo de políticas públicas mexicano. Para que esta pues pueda incluir a la sociedad civil de una forma significativa en su formulación e implementación, que nosotras documentamos en nuestro informe, pues que realmente no hubo un diálogo proactivo a través de consultas, mesas de trabajo, etcétera. Se hizo ya posterior al anuncio y sobre todo se dio preponderancia a organizaciones del norte global, dejando atrás las organizaciones de base y las organizaciones locales, ¿no? Y también esto ayudaría muchísimo a que, pese a los cambios de administración, que estamos muy cerca del cierre de esta administración, se le pueda dar continuidad a esta política exterior feminista, que al momento es no certera, que siga, y hacerla acorde al ciclo de políticas públicas mexicano daría paso para que se pueda medir y evaluar fácilmente, que actualmente no hay una ruta crítica donde podamos seguir los indicadores, los responsables, el presupuesto asignado y la línea de tiempo, ¿no? Y pues a eso, a grandes rasgos, les sigo invitando a que lean el reporte en sus versiones en español y en inglés. Y muchas gracias.
Gracias, Dai. And let me just congratulate you all for this tremendous report. It really is an incredible contribution to a theme that I know that everybody here works very hard on. So let's move now into some commentary. We're very lucky that we have 3 commentators who will be responding to the report that are with us for this panel. They are Rosa Emilia Salamanca. Rosa Emilia doesn't have her camera on due to some technical difficulties, so we will just be hearing her. She's joining us from Colombia, where she is the Executive Director of Corporación de Investigación y Acción Social y Económica, la CIACE. She is a member of the Women, Peace and Security Collective for Reflection and Action, which calls for a transformation towards a more peaceful Colombian society. Rosa Emilia also participates in Coalición 1025, which advocates for a Colombian national action plan on women, peace, and security. So thank you for joining us today, Rosa. Laura McDonald is a full professor. She's joining us from Mexico City this morning too. She's a full professor in the Department of Political Science and the Institute of Political Economy at Carleton University. She's published numerous articles in journals and edited various collections. Her recent work looks at transnational activism in North America around labor rights, migration, and human rights in Mexico. Laura is a research associate with the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternative and a member of the Canadian Feminist Foreign Policy Working Group. So it's a pleasure to have you here with us too, Laura. I'm calling you by your Spanish name, apparently.
Está bien.
Gracias. Sometimes I have trouble with the code switch. Priyanka Bide is the co-founder and director of the Cuba 9 Initiative. It's an independent, female-led geopolitical advisory firm based in Mumbai in India, from where Priyanka is joining us this morning, or this afternoon, or this evening. Priyanka works with the initiative on the initiative works to mainstream issues that need greater intellectual capacity and focus. Since 2019, Priyanka has co-led Cuba 9 Initiative's flagship program on gender and foreign policy. She comes from a strategy and communications background with over a decade of experience working with the private and non-profit sectors. So once again, very lucky to have these wonderful speakers. Thank you also, Priyanka, for joining us. I'm going to fire some questions at you, the 3 of you. The first one is for you, Laura. Laura, can you speak to us about the lessons and takeaways from this report? What are the lessons and takeaways for other countries with a feminist foreign policy?
Hola, good morning, buenos dias, bonjour. Thanks so much for the invitation to participate in this event. I'm fortunate to actually be in Mexico right now, where I'm experiencing some of the realities for women. So it's great to have this exchange both with Mexican feminists and interested people and feminists from across the world in this virtual forum. And I really want to congratulate the authors of the report for the excellent work they've done in carefully analyzing Mexican feminist foreign policy, despite the evident lack of information that was available about what actually the government understands as feminist foreign policy and what they're doing that might be different from previous administrations. So what can we learn? I would say, despite the important comment made by Danny that we have to recognize that realities are very different in the global south and the global north, we are facing many of the same issues around lack of policy coherence across government ministries, inconsistency, some elements of virtue signaling. So often we see governments that have a feminist foreign policy may be really good in multilateral fora, as is Mexico, but forget about this commitment when an issue it considers really important comes up. So in Canada, for example, we see this, that FFP sort of disappears when the government's talking about issues they think are really important, like Canada's Indo-Pacific strategy or the behavior of Canadian companies abroad. Secondly, the report highlights the crucial role that Mexican feminist organizations have played in developing feminist approaches to understanding the world and foreign policy, not just in their own country, but at a global level. So feminist foreign policy is not just a gift from a benevolent government, but reflects the history of struggle by women and gender diverse individuals for decades to insert a gender perspective into public policy in all terrains, both domestic and international. So this lesson is you have to push the government to integrate a feminist perspective, and you have to keep pushing to encourage it through dialogue and critique, to encourage them to do better in really living up to the commitments that a feminist foreign policy implies. Thirdly, as Danny mentioned, Mexico is the first global South country to openly adopt a feminist foreign policy, and she has also appropriately highlighted the limitations of that policy to date. But I would say, and trying not to be paternalistic, I do think it's important that Mexico and other global South countries have adopted this approach and are beginning to work within it, so that we learn that this is not just a luxury for the global North, but can be adopted in many contexts that may be seen as not very welcoming or propitious for a feminist foreign policy. Certainly, Mexico suffers from grave violations of women's human rights and deeply entrenched patriarchal norms that permeate society. And in that context, we have to think, is adopting this policy a help or a hindrance to advances? I think there are many problems with the way the government has gone about it, but on balance, I think the report suggests that feminists can use this commitment to encourage, exhort, and demand that their governments do better. And finally, I just want to say that also including governments in the global South pushes us to think beyond the traditional policies that have been understood to be affected by feminist foreign policy, like aid policy or women, peace, and security issues, but to bring in other important issues like the structures of the global economic system, trade policy, financial policy, and with their inclusion, we have to work harder to transform those structures and not take them for granted. Mexico has a long way to go in this regard, but it's not a problem unique to Mexico or to countries in the global South. Thanks, I'll stop there.
Thank you, Laura. Pleasure to have somebody else in the same city and time zone this morning. Priyanka, our question for you is, how does feminist foreign policy create opportunities for collaboration and cooperation? So thinking here about what we call South-South cooperation, bilateral relations, relations with civil society and government. Can you speak a little bit to how feminist foreign policy creates those opportunities for creates opportunities for collaboration and cooperation?
Sure, thank you for the question, and thank you for allowing me to be a part of this wonderful event. The report, I think, brings out some very critical questions and proposes pathways that we should all look at. But to come back to your question, from our experience, To give a little context, Kubernetes Initiative started looking at the feminist foreign policy conversation in 2019, when it was a very much focused in the global north. And when Mexico actually announced its feminist foreign policy, it was intriguing because it was closer then to our context than when compared to the other approaches out there. But from our experience, what has been encouraging is that because essentially it is a concept that is still in development, it is still evolving. We have reached out and spoken to most countries that have taken this path, and all are learning from their experiences and growing not only their understanding of what this could mean, but how this could play out within their countries. There is a lot of scope for greater collaboration between the North and South, and between the South and South as well. We have, for example, we are part of the Feminist Foreign Policy Collaborative, and there are initiatives that are open for organizations to come together and research together on this issue as it develops. And so in that sense, it's an open space, but also to speak to something that Laura had said, right, at the end of the day, it is countries that will have to make this decision. So while the intellectual and thinking space is open, and there are a few countries in the global north that are also open because they have a consultative mechanism. They're kind of open to hearing what we have to say. At the end of the day, it rests on the country to make the pathways and follow this path. And so in that sense, then it could differ how effective the advocacy and the research is, how it's going to impact the country trajectories. So that's something that I'm really curious to follow. And so this report is important because here you have another side to what we've been hearing in the feminist foreign policy conversation. And this actually, to me, opens up an opportunity to make the policy more accountable, right? Because whatever you say, if this policy did not exist, it would not give you an opportunity to send out those requests for information, to kind of although you have not gotten the data that you want, but the very fact that you could approach your government for some of this data is perhaps because this policy exists. And so it might be good for other countries as well to adopt some form of an inclusive foreign policy, which is the term we use, because in India, we find that the term feminist does not translate very well, and it's still considered a very, very Western concept. So we are using the term inclusive more to push our conversations forward. I will stop there and allow for more questions.
Thank you so much, Priyanka. Rosa Emilia, we would love you to speak, if you can, to the question of what is the role of civil society in feminist foreign policy?
Bueno, muy buenos días, y es un placer estar aquí con ustedes. Realmente a mí me ha parecido muy interesante el reporte que ustedes han hecho, el informe, y para mí es un honor estar acá. Bueno, ¿cuál es el papel de las organizaciones en la construcción de una política exterior feminista? Yo creo que es vital. Yo creo que hoy en día una de las grandes discusiones que hay sobre las políticas en general es el tema de participación, discusión, inclusión y innovación. Y creo que desde esa perspectiva la generación de nuevas políticas implican importantes procesos de inclusión, pero no solamente inclusión nominal, sino de inclusión efectiva, de inclusión real, para poder modelar esas políticas de otra manera. América Latina está hoy en un debate muy interesante para reencontrar su identidad. para poder definir su identidad. Es un proceso de madurez, es un proceso de como un salto cualitativo. Y en esa medida, cuando estamos hablando de políticas feministas exteriores y de la contribución de las organizaciones, es que las organizaciones nos debemos estar preguntando hoy en día qué es, para qué sirve, qué implica una política nacional feminista o políticas nacionales feministas que sean integradas en todos los aspectos de los países. Y eso que implica en términos de una cara, de una apuesta, de una mirada en el ámbito exterior, en el ámbito global. Por eso el informe me parece muy inspirador porque si bien México es uno de los primeros países que tiene una política feminista, Colombia también ha declarado ponerse, digamos, en la búsqueda de una definición de una política exterior feminista. Todavía, o creo que el camino que se abre es un camino muy interesante, pero un camino que implica profundos debates de sentido y contenido. Hoy en día las mujeres y las organizaciones feministas tenemos incluidas múltiples aspectos en materia de derechos de las mujeres en los ámbitos nacionales. Pero yo creo que también tenemos que dar saltos cualitativos en el marco de lo que significa nuestras apuestas regionales y globales. Para mí las políticas exteriores feministas participativas tienen una impresionante capacidad y una importante oportunidad de comunicación entre organizaciones feministas de base, organizaciones feministas nacionales, regionales y globales en la construcción de un movimiento de cambio muy profundo, de una construcción muy diferente en términos de lo que significan ejes sustantivos como la economía, como la seguridad, como la paz, como lo que hemos denominado desarrollo. Entonces creo que hoy en día una política nacional feminista y una política internacional feminista, a partir de las organizaciones como actores políticas y como agendatarias y agentes de esa construcción de sentido de esa política son fundamentales. Entonces, creo que no hay políticas hoy que se puedan hacer sin la sociedad civil y más con una sociedad civil cambiante, demandante y con nuevas miradas de interseccionalidad identitaria que son más que interesantes en América Latina. Dejo por ahí para que podamos ir siguiendo la conversación.
Gracias, Rosa Emilia. Thank you very much. The final question for our three commentators is directed at all three of you. So you may choose who would like to take it on. The question is, how can we enhance accountability in feminist foreign policy? I wonder who would like to take it up.
That question is actually meant to be for each of the commentators. So if you want to take her answer,
perfect.
that'd
Even
be great.
better. Okay, yeah, let's go one by one. That is so much better. Laura, how can we enhance accountability in feminist foreign policy?
Yeah, I think that's a really crucial issue that's opened up by this report, as so much other work on feminist foreign policy. Because I think we can't say we have a feminist foreign policy, or at least a credible one, unless we find ways to put in place measures to ensure transparency and accountability. And this report really highlights how important that is, that there be ways of measuring what governments are saying are really true when they say that they have a feminist foreign policy. But it's all very well to say that we need to do this, but how do you do it? What would be a feminist approach to evaluating government commitments? We too in the Canadian Working Group on Feminist Foreign Policy are struggling with this problem. What kind of indicators would we use? How do you move beyond purely quantitative approaches, box checking, ticking, to make the approach truly inclusive and responding to the power dynamics at work? How do we make the process really inclusive and transformational? So again, I would highlight, as was just discussed by Rosa, that that civil societies in many areas of international relations, civil societies play a crucial role in providing expertise, in channeling voices from the grassroots, and in challenging governments to do better. So we need, civil societies have to be actively involved in the process of evaluation and monitoring to make sure that feminist foreign policy really lives up to its requirements as stated in the policy. And this also requires resources. You can't just expect civil society organizations, especially in the Global South, who, as someone said at the beginning, really don't have resources to just donate their labor for free to engage in this monitoring process. So, and the Swedish feminist foreign policy, now defunct apparently, did recognize that a crucial element of the policy would be resources. And in the Mexican context, with all the cutbacks that have occurred in the foreign ministry and in other ministries, is very difficult for them, even for the government, to engage in effective monitoring, let alone civil society organizations. So we need to think about ways to channel resources to organizations in the grassroots and at national levels, to be able to engage in dialogue, monitoring, critique, analysis, and so forth. But those are just some ideas.
Great, thanks so much, Laura. Priyanka, over to you. How can we enhance accountability in feminist foreign policy?
This is a very difficult question. Oh, this sounds so simple. But I think I'll echo a lot of what Laura said. Also, I think we need to position the accountability from within the country that is looking at it, right? So if we take even the broader measures of what Sweden had originally drawn out of representation rights and resources, right? What it means for each country. How do you ensure that you go beyond just the numbers and ensure that it's not, as Anna had correctly spoken about, it's not just optics, right? It has to go deeper. So in that sense, it has to be, these measures should be decided from within the country. And so it is very much the role of civil society organizations within each country to work together and come to some measures that make sense for them, because the way you would measure it in the West would be very different from the South, and this is important to recognize. And the other measure of accountability also should be for the countries that have announced feminist foreign policy. How do they how are they being inclusive towards even other geographies, right? So not only in terms of perhaps when you talk about it, going beyond the binaries to see this inclusivity in terms of geographies. How do their policies measure in implementation in geographies around the world as well? So those are just two ideas that I'd like to contribute.
Wonderful, thank you, Priyanka. Rosa Emilia, over to you. Tell us,
Sí.
how can we enhance accountability in feminist?
Bueno, yo también creo que esto es un problema complejo. Es bien, porque implica la coherencia de los países internamente y la coherencia de los países al exterior. Y eso implica que hay políticas locales, nacionales y hay políticas internacionales. ¿Cómo lograr que la manera en que se monitorean las políticas nacionales sea también útil para el monitoreo de las políticas exteriores? Yo creo que ahí tenemos un reto muy interesante y quisiera poner el ejemplo que hemos ido desarrollando alrededor de la resolución 1325. La resolución 1325 tiene y logramos hacer una reunión que permitió desarrollar indicadores globales en materia de la resolución 1325. Fue un acuerdo, digamos, de monitoreo entre la sociedad civil. Pero luego nosotros tuvimos que hacer un trabajo y hacemos un trabajo permanente de localización y de territorialización de los indicadores. Entonces, hoy en día para poder tener una política monitoreada en coherencia, tiene que tener indicadores micro, meso y macro que puedan conversar entre sí y ver la posibilidad de que realmente esos indicadores y políticas apropiados por la gente sean efectivos. Por ejemplo, Canadá tiene una política exterior feminista donde está incluida la 325. No, lo importante es el impacto en lo local y luego cómo eso rebota en lo meso y en lo macro para que países como Colombia, como México, como otros tengan posibilidades de tener indicadores en reciprocidad. Es un desafío interesantísimo. A mí, la verdad, esta posibilidad de tener políticas exteriores feministas me parecen tremendos, es una oportunidad gigantesca. Yo agradezco mucho este informe, que es de hecho un proceso inicial de monitoreo muy valioso, muy inspirador, y me parece que esta es una oportunidad para que nosotras podamos hacer un seguimiento y un monitoreo en esos 3 niveles que he mencionado, muy efectivo y que nos llevan a procesos de organización mucho más robustas.
Thank you, Rosa Emilia. Thank you to all of our commentators for those contributions. You've given us so much to think about. We're moving now into a Q&A. I'm just going to check with you, Dani. How are we doing this? Where can I see the questions?
Yeah, of course. I can read it. I have
Okay,
it right here.
great.
We had one question from Thomas Dunmore, and it's: foreign policy is sometimes viewed as the domain of professional diplomats, often men in suits. So what does a commitment to a feminist foreign policy mean for civil society, for feminist movements, for people, citizens committed to feminist change in Mexico and in the world? Does it create space for new, very different kinds of diplomacy? And I think we've partially answered this question already, but I know that Anna has a great response to this question as well. So I'm gonna turn it over to her, and also if anybody else wants to respond or to add to this response, please just raise your hand.
Right, thank you. Well, it's a question we also have. So I'm gonna try to answer with the experience we've had so far in discussions and with other feminists. Yeah, I mean, of course, this is one of those areas that was still a little bit, I wouldn't say untouched, because I think there is a long, very important history of women in diplomacy. The Mexican government has actually, I think they just published a book a couple of years ago or something about women in diplomacy. So it is not something that was not debated. But then, of course, we know that feminism isn't just about women, right? So I would say, yes, it opens the door in ways that perhaps not even the government themselves were quite aware of it. In a conversation I was having with it was Dinora and Rosa here, who's joining us today, last week, we were saying that some governments that decided to implement a feminist foreign policy perhaps weren't quite aware that once you decide to bring the feminist framework, because I don't want to call it a label, into the scene, you're also opening the door for feminists to ask questions and to try to find a way to have a say in how this foreign policy is being developed. So what I was telling Rosa last week is now we're not going to let them get us out of the room. We're going to put our feet on the door and we're going to stay here. We're going to keep on insisting on these questions. Why? Because actually, feminist IR itself has, in my opinion, lagged behind in asking enough questions about diplomacy, I would say. So this is actually opening that door just to start asking who else can join in the table, who else has a say in this. For instance, Brazil, with Lula's government, has also opened the door for indigenous peoples to participate in foreign policy. Canada has also made its work on these areas. So yes, I would say it opens the door to rethink or democratize the process of foreign policy, of how it is made. And even though we might still have to learn a lot about how actually foreign policy in general is decided in each country, it at least allows us to ask those questions. Yeah.
Thank you, Anna. I think you had a response to this too, Laura, am I right?
Yes, sure. I think it's a great question. And I think including the term feminist together with the term foreign policy, it's a little oxymoronic in a way, because feminists have always challenged, the public-private divide and binaries between state and non-state actors. So I think if as Rosa was just saying, not Rosa, who was just talking, sorry, it's too early, sorry, Anna, that, we have to think beyond those traditional conceptions of what foreign policy is. And then it's, Thomas referred to the men in suits, but it's only the men in suits in the foreign ministry that are considered the relevant actors in traditional approaches to foreign policy. And in Mexico, for example, the other ministries haven't been brought into the discussion of feminist foreign policy, like the trade ministry or economy or environmental or migration institutions, who really do play an important role in projecting Mexico's role abroad and in interacting with actors in the regional and global context. So I think we need to make this more of it has to be more of like whole of government approach. There's a tendency for silos, it might be some people in one section of the foreign ministry might be working on this really hard, but not communicating very well, and also encountering resistance from other members of the foreign ministry. And then it becomes more complicated when you bring in other actors. I also wanted to mention the case of Chile, which has for many years been promoting, or quite a few years, let's say, promoting adoption of gender chapters in trade agreements, which is a really interesting approach. And we haven't seen many other countries adopt that, although Canada took that up on the basis of the Chilean example. It wasn't something imported from the global north. It was a global south country that pioneered that approach. So thinking more about trade relations, the role of corporations abroad, those two have important impacts on gender differentials and other forms of differential inclusion in the global scene. And so this whole approach is really rewarding and important, because it forces us to think creatively about these problems in a new way.
Great, thank you, Laura. Priyanka, did you want to respond to this too?
Yes, I just wanted to add, it's also important to remember that traditionally the men in suits, solving problems, was solving security problems that were very much in the military space, right? But what has changed now, and which has made the whole concept of feminist foreign policy so important, is that
security constitutes so many things. It constitutes climate, it constitutes trade, as was correctly said. The Canada-Chile trade agreement has an excellent chapter on gender and how they're looking to bring in gender in a very measured manner. So it's important to remember that as well, which is why we now need different people around the table, right? Not only the old men in suits.
Great, thank you. We have a question from the audience, another one from France. The question is, in France, we don't know what a feminist foreign policy looks like either, despite the demands. Oh, Rosa.
No, yo estaba pensando si también querías una respuesta de mi parte porque
Disculpa.
no entendí.
If you would like to respond to that question, yes, please go ahead. If not, that is also fine.
I didn't know. So go ahead. Excuse me.
No problem. Thank you. Okay, back to France. We have a wonderfully global audience here, as we really hoped for. So the question from France being, we don't know what a feminist foreign policy looks like either. Despite the demands and recommendations of civil society, the government has still not created clear guidelines for this policy. Do you in Mexico, as civil society, have access to collaborate or co-construct the feminist foreign policy with the government? Do you have a space dedicated for this? So this would be a question for those in Mexico. Dai or Danny or Anna, would one of you like to address it? I think the answer to access to collaborating with the government is probably no. I think we've maybe established that by now, but if there's something you would like to add there. I guess just on the question of.
I don't think we can hear you.
Oh,
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Bueno, voy a responder en español para hacer uso de la traducción. Y bueno,
ay, no escuché.
ya, sí, ya. Sí, bueno, en el caso de México, la Secretaría de Relaciones Exteriores sí tiene, digamos, un área dedicada como a la sociedad civil, la Dirección de Atención a la Sociedad Civil. Y pues permanentemente esto fue una lucha que se hizo para incluir esta área, porque no había interacción de la sociedad civil con la política exterior, ¿no? Entonces, a raíz de la reforma del 2011 de derechos humanos, pues se puso esta área que ha intentado pues traer las discusiones a la sociedad civil, sobre todo en el ámbito multilateral, pero donde es deficiente es en lo que ya comentaba Laura, ¿no? Sobre todo en las áreas de relaciones diplomáticas bilaterales con países, temas de presupuesto, pues realmente la participación de la sociedad civil no se incluyen en las negociaciones, sobre todo en las rondas de algunos tratados comerciales importantes, o incluso en temas de migración, pues tampoco es una lucha constante que se abra el diálogo con la Secretaría de Relaciones Exteriores. Cuando se anunció la política exterior feminista, pues muchas organizaciones feministas y grupos de base tuvieron interés en establecer diálogo con la Secretaría de Relaciones Exteriores. Nosotros resaltamos el esfuerzo de esta iniciativa que se llama Observatorio Mexicano de Política Exterior Feminista de México. Sin embargo, pues hacemos notar que fue desde arriba hacia abajo, ¿no? Realmente no fue un involucramiento inicial de la Secretaría para incluir a estos grupos en la construcción, sino más bien fue un anuncio y después a quien pues consideró pertinente pues tratar de influir, pues se le fue involucrando. Nosotros no tenemos información de que haya sido como un proceso formal o demás. Yo creo que el gobierno sí ha tenido ya interés posterior en abrir estos espacios, ha hecho algunas consultas y lo celebramos, pero sí sería importante pues tal vez un diálogo permanente más formalizado Sobre todo que no sea como la forma que comúnmente se hace, ¿no? Que son consultas en donde nada más se extrae información, realmente no hay espacio para trabajar conjuntamente en propuestas de política pública, y pues realmente depende mucho de la coyuntura, ¿no? Sí se necesita más allá de una foto en redes sociales, y pues nada, creo que ahí lo dejo, y muchas gracias, sí, sí.
Thank you, Dainora. We have another question from the audience. The question is, as you pointed out, you being all of our presenters, a lot of the discussion around feminist foreign policy is around ODA or increasing funds for feminist movements. Can you better clarify how countries like Mexico can address the issues of resources? For countries that are receiving funds, can feminist foreign policy inform how they use these funds?
I can start by
Thanks,
answering
Danny.
this question, and I would shift how that question was asked a little bit, and basically shift it away from resources and instead try to focus on what are based on Mexico's context, and because Mexico doesn't have the capacity to provide as much development aid, what are the other things? What are the other strengths? What is within Mexico's capacity? And how could this be linked to feminist foreign policy? So an area that we really expand on in the report are consular services. Mexico has a very strong presence, has immigrants around the world. I'm an immigrant living in Australia, Mexican immigrant living in Australia. And it has over 52, I think it has 52 consulates in the US. And we think that part of Mexico's feminist foreign policy and what it could look like, rather than focusing on development aid, would be by strengthening these consular services to provide support for example, Mexican survivors of domestic violence abroad, and that it could really leverage this network and leverage these other strengths and these other capacities, especially Mexico's consular branch is so strong, and the Foreign Affairs Service, what they call it, the Foreign Service, is also very, very good. So how can we look beyond just development aid, reimagine and be a little bit more creative about what feminist foreign policy can look like, and how do we adapt that to a different context? So this is one example where we think that there is a lot of potential for feminist foreign policy in providing these services for immigrants, and obviously honing in on the issue of immigration, which is so important in Mexico's foreign policy. And I'll leave it at that for now. I think I cheated a little bit because I changed the question around, but I hope that helps answer how we are thinking about feminist foreign policy.
Thanks, Danny. Did anybody else want to address that question about how countries like Mexico can address the issue of resources, development aid, how feminist foreign policy can work on that theme effectively?
Bueno, a mí me gustaría hablar sobre el tema porque, según entendí, la pregunta dice cómo las organizaciones feministas pueden rendir cuentas frente al trabajo que hacen, o no sé si no la entendí bien. Yo creo que la sociedad civil en general en estos momentos en el mundo debe ser apoyada muchísimo, porque creo que es en este momento en la sociedad civil muchas de las respuestas que el mundo político no encuentra, porque el mundo de la política repite de manera insistente y constante las mismas fórmulas, las mismas salidas, las mismas condiciones para reproducir los mismos problemas que tenemos, y la falta de inclusión de género es una de ellas. Entonces, al apoyar las organizaciones feministas, las organizaciones de mujeres, las organizaciones sociales, estamos apoyando una posibilidad de consolidar nuevos discursos, nuevas acciones, nuevas prácticas que brinden nuevas respuestas a la política interior y exterior de los países. Entonces, creo que la posibilidad que las organizaciones de mujeres, las organizaciones feministas, las organizaciones LGBTQ, etcétera, sean apoyadas, traen elementos novedosos sobre inclusión, libertad, etcétera. Por eso, al mismo tiempo, una política exterior feminista implica que las organizaciones que quieren participar en su definición se cualifiquen. No es fácil participar en política general y en política exterior. Estamos hablando de los temas que ustedes están diciendo, es decir, cuáles son las políticas de desarrollo, cuáles son las políticas de paz, cuáles son las políticas de seguridad. Estamos hablando de políticas macroeconómicas y por eso el apoyo económico a la sociedad civil implica su cualificación, su poder llevar de lo cotidiano a lo global las respuestas y las preguntas que realmente hoy no han encontrado respuesta en las políticas exteriores tradicionales.
Thank you so much, Rosa Emilia. We have a few minutes left, so I will take the final question, pose the final question from the audience. It's from Arjot Ferrer de Oliveira. She says, thank you so much for this webinar. And her questions are, do you have special recommendations regarding gendered public aid? What are you expecting of other countries implementing this type of feminist foreign policy? Also, what would a feminist defense policy look like? So we'll see if we can get through them. If anybody wants to take that from the top. On gendered public aid, perhaps we've already addressed some of the questions around, at least around the kind of economic capacity of feminist foreign policy, but perhaps somebody would be able to speak to the question of what would a feminist defense policy look like?
Well, perdón, si quieres
Sí,
yo puedo
anda.
hacer una intervención
Dale.
cortica. Miren, las mujeres y desde el feminismo nosotras venimos planteando una pregunta central. ¿Cómo puede ser una política de seguridad porque yo creo que hay que enmarcar la política de defensa, si la entendí bien, y la política de seguridad, etcétera, como políticas que tienen que ser transformadas. Hoy las políticas de defensa son profundamente patriarcales y hoy necesitamos empezar a pensar en políticas que cambien el control de la seguridad al cuidado desde la seguridad. Nosotros pensamos que hay un centro y un eje en toda la política feminista que es muy valioso y es la resignificación del cuidado en el marco de la libertad. Y desde ahí una política de defensa, que también lo hemos tratado de discutir acá en Colombia, debe ir migrando de una política fundamentalmente del control a una política que esté basada en el cuidado.
Thank you, Rosa. Were you going to speak to this too, Anna? Am I right?
Yeah, just very quickly, I just wanted to bring the question a little bit to the Mexican context, because, well, it's something that we've been also addressing as to this huge contradiction that, I mean, of course, the question about how does a defense policy, if possible, looks from feminism, that's a long-standing debate that we can have another event just dedicated to answering that question. I would love to participate on that. But just in short, and to contrast it to the feminist foreign policy in Mexico, that is actually one of the big, the contradictions, the open contradictions of this case. Since as we've noted before, the increasing militarization of public security in Mexico, not only public security, but other areas of the public administration, the increase in the military expenditure from this administration is in sharp contrast to what Laura was mentioning before, the cuts directed to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Secretariat of Foreign Affairs, and particularly also to anything related to gender. I mean, at this point of the administration, the current administration, we are lucky that in Mujeres still exists, honestly, because it was an institution, it is the institution that is dedicated to women's rights, to taking care, to developing care policies, among other issues. And we are really lucky that it still exists. So how does it look like? That's a question we still have to answer, but certainly it doesn't look, it is not what we see now in Mexico. And as much as some people try to sort of shift the debate and say, well, but when we are talking about feminist foreign policy in Mexico, it is something different to whatever is happening within the country. These are two different realms. And when we praise Mexico for the feminist foreign policy, we do not refer to whatever the country is doing within its borders. Well, I would say my answer to that is, isn't it the point of feminism to question those dichotomies and to say we must demand coherence, and not only coherence, to actually understand how these two processes actually talk to each other? And so it is, I think these are a really good question that we might develop in another moment. But yeah, I just really wanted to highlight this really huge contradiction, because the Mexican government in forums like in the UN Security Council says the increasing militarization and military expenditure puts women in danger, and yet that is exactly what it does.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Anna. We are at time, but for those who are able to stay, we will just take a few more minutes. Dinora, I know, has a response to this question too, about the prospect of a feminist defense policy, what it might look like. Dinora.
Sí, gracias. No, realmente yo solo quería añadir a la parte que se discutió sobre ayuda oficial al desarrollo, bueno, muy ligado con la política de defensa. Nosotras sí queremos traer estas discusiones que ya tienen tiempo de Shift the Power y de Colonize Aid, porque en el caso de México es muy importante el hecho de que varias de las dependencias que tenemos de derechos humanos, como la Comisión de Ayuda a Personas Refugiadas, incluso la Secretaría de Relaciones Exteriores, pues un financiamiento importante de esas instituciones viene de organismos de Naciones Unidas. Y esto no necesariamente es negativo, pero obviamente genera pues mucha dependencia, ¿no? En capacidades, que al momento pues no sabemos cómo solucionar este problema, porque, bueno, no solo en esos temas, sino también obviamente en el tema de violencia contra las mujeres. Por ejemplo, programas muy importantes que ayudaron, como la iniciativa Spotlight en distintos municipios para erradicar el feminicidio, pues están por terminar o ya terminaron, ¿no? Entonces, algunos apoyos pues siguen, pero ¿cómo hacemos para que no necesariamente tengamos que depender de esta ayuda internacional? Y esa parte, pues consideramos que los feminismos lo han puesto pues en las discusiones, ¿no? Generar, como ya lo decía Ana y Daniela, que no estos discursos de salvadorismo blanco, pues ya no existan, ¿no? Sobre todo, de qué forma ya eliminamos como organizaciones intermediarias y que los recursos lleguen directamente como a las organizaciones que están operando. ¿Cómo logramos que pues estos impuestos al comercio global, pues ya no afecten a México? ¿Cómo hacemos que pues esas empresas multinacionales que hay en México y que no pagan impuestos y que afectan a los derechos laborales en México, y que eso repercute también en cómo México no tiene recursos propios, pues eso ya se pueda ver, ¿no? En la política exterior feminista. Entonces, sí, requiere también como un análisis interno de cómo fortalecemos las finanzas en México, que en México no recaudamos suficiente dinero a través de nuestros impuestos. Entonces, sí tiene que ver mucho como de autonomía, independencia económica de los países del sur global. Y pues nada, ahí lo dejo.
Thanks, Di. Well, let's close. What an extraordinary group of speakers we've had today. Thank you so much to you all who spoke and also to the audience for joining us. I'm not sure, Danny or Anna or Di, if you would like to add any closing remarks at this point. We are at time.
No, thank you so much, everyone, for tuning in, for joining us. And thanks again to all of our amazing panelists, to the interpreters, and of course to Nicole, who's in the back end, helping us with everything. And also thank you for Beth, who made all of this possible. We appreciate it. Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Gracias, gracias.
Thank you. Gracias.
Thank
Thank you, Anne, for
Gracias. Muchas
moderating.
gracias a todos. Thank you.